So today I am really excited to be joined by Mel Nebhrajani, who is Director General of Litigation with Justice and Security in the Government Legal Department, working for our government. Government Legal is actually an organisation that is very close to my heart, as I was privileged enough to sit on their board for 5 years. And it's a really amazing organisation doing fascinating work. And for any lawyer listening who doesn't already work there, keep listening, because there may be a whole new avenue to your career that you hadn't ever thought of before that could open up to you as an idea once you've listened to this podcast. So as well as being really excited about being able to do a bit of a sales pitch for Government Legal, more of which later, I'm really delighted to have Mel join me. If I were a senior politician in government dealing with all of the pressures that we know that brings, Mel is absolutely the person that I'd want to have by my side. Not just because of the wise and experienced counsel that she brings, but also, as you will discover, because of her wonderfully supportive, considered and calm approach to the knottiest problems, even when delivering messages that perhaps some ministers are not always keen to hear. So she's absolutely the person I'd want there supporting me. And it's a delight to welcome you to this podcast, Mel.
Oh, Erica, what a great introduction. Thank you so much.
It's absolutely true. You have people listening should listen to your manner about how you respond to things. There's something very special about the way, about your whole manner, your whole ambience that you bring. So can I just ask you, maybe you could tell us a bit about yourself, your background, what brought you into the law, how you ended up at Government Legal. Yeah, it'd be great to hear a bit of your background.
Thanks, Erica. So I had quite a meandering journey, shall we say, to the law. I recommend that. We may go into that in a little more detail at some point about what I learned from having that journey. So I didn't come to law from reading law at university, or indeed straight to law from the university. I read English, and I often say to people, if you wanted to be a lawyer, read something other than law first. And if you don't want to be a lawyer, a law degree is a great degree to have as a foundation for business or whatever else you want to do. So having read English, I decided to go into publishing for a couple of years. And I ought to say that I do come from quite a long line of lawyers on my mother's side of the family. So I have a long line of barristers in particular who trained over here but practiced in India. And I think I probably did that good thing that all teenagers should do, which was to really set my face against doing anything that my family members had done. So I absolutely graduated with my English degree, fully intending to do anything but law. And I went into publishing, and it happened to be that I graduated into a recession, and the first job I got was in legal publishing.
Oh, really?
So I think the universe had a plan for me, Erica, I would say. And I found myself being much, much more interested in the law than in the business of publishing. And I had a choice a couple of years after being in that publishing world for a while to think, do I go down the generalist publishing route, or do I perhaps scratch that itch that had always been in my background? So I decided to scratch the itch and train as a lawyer, and I intended fully to be a barrister. And in fact, that is what I did. So I worked in chambers as a Chancery barrister for about 4 years. It wasn't a particularly happy prospect. Again, Erica, I can say a little bit more about that. I really felt that my values didn't quite fit, that it wasn't work that I really wanted to do. And I found myself really drawn to the government legal profession because of that public service. And I have to say, from the minute my first foot in the door, I found myself really to have come home. It felt like coming home. I can put it as clearly as that.
Oh, amazing. And obviously it's quite a big step if you'd started earning, I presume, to then decide to go back and retrain. What was that like as a decision?
Gosh, it was a hard decision, I have to say, because even 2 years out of education slightly makes you feel a little bit de-skilled about whether you're able to sit in a classroom again and learn and do exams. But you know what? I really felt that publishing wasn't for me, that I had to take that leap of faith. There is that sense in sometimes, what can go wrong if you just take that step? You have to have faith in yourself, I think, that actually you'll make anything that you do, any step you take, you will make succeed for yourself if you've got sufficient determination. So although it was quite a risk and it felt a bit scary, I probably used that quite a lot in my career to give myself confidence that I can take that less expected step and that it will work out really well.
Yeah, actually, can we just stop there? Because I do think, I've been reading up a lot about the difference between men and women, and self-confidence comes into that a lot.
Yeah.
And nearly all of the literature and research on self-confidence talks about failure and action. Like, you have to take action to build confidence. You have to have enough self-esteem to think that you have the capability to deal with something difficult if it comes up. But you've got to fail. The more you fail, the more you'll succeed. And there's a great Nike advert with Michael Jordan talking about how often he failed, obviously to be incredibly successful. But it is really interesting that the fact that you did that early on in your career and you thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? So you tell me a bit about how that's played out. Have you gone back to that thought, again, and thought, well, actually, I'm going to do something here that is a bit out of my comfort zone, but I know I did that thing earlier in my career. So,
completely.
Why not?
So, Erica, I would absolutely say that first experience of feeling discomfort in a situation and being willing to change it has absolutely been the foundation of a lot of the steps I've taken. So when I was at the Chancery bar, I was pretty miserable. Just wasn't for me. As I say, my values didn't really align. I was doing lots of work, making people homeless day in, day out. For a year, I was the acceptable place of mortgage repossession. And it was awful. But of course, when you've trained for as long as I had to get to Chancery bar, when there weren't many Asian people, I was certainly not many Asian women at the Chancery bar, you feel that you're giving up a big prize, that you're going to regret this step. And lots of people told me that I would regret that step. But the fact that I had made a change and pivoted before was the thing that I used as a springboard to enable me to pivot again when it wasn't right for me in chambers. And I would say to anyone, really trust your instinct. You know yourself. You know what's important to you. And if your work doesn't align with your own personal values, then you absolutely have to make that change. And you know what? I don't know anyone who has made that change who has regretted it. Yeah. Everybody I've spoken to. And again, you can learn from other people, in terms of building self-confidence, you can learn from other people's experience and see how that has shaped their future and take a bit of confidence from that as well.
Yeah. I mean, just out of interest, because I know very little about the bar. So what were you doing at the bar when you were making people homeless? What were you doing at the Chancery?
So the Chancery bar is a mix of contentious work and non-contentious work. So you're sometimes in court, but not always in court. But at the bottom end of the bar, you're often in court and doing things like landlord and tenant possession actions or mortgage possession actions. And because it was, a really big brief to be hired by one of the very big building societies to do all of their mortgage possession work, there's a lot of money in it. And so my clerk was very much think about the fee, think about, the money that you're going to earn. And when I said to him, I'm afraid the money is not enough, he said, well, I'll get you more money. And I'm like, no, the money is not enough because it's not the money that is the thing that is going to spur me on. And when I look back at my sort of family history, I talk about having these barristers, being my great-grandfather and my grandfather in particular, they were people who trained over here, but were really giving back to the public. So they were part of the Indian independence movement. They were friends of Nehru and Gandhi and Jinnah and others in that independence movement. So I have in that hinterland, I guess, a sense in which, as individuals, we're all powerful. We can make really positive change in the world. You've got a choice to make about how you're going to spend your time. And I found myself thinking I could not spend all those years training to be a barrister, all the money that it costs, all the effort to go and just make endless people homeless. It just was not for me.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. So Mel, then tell me a bit about how did you make the leap? Was it straight to government legal from being at the Chancery bar?
Yeah. So I thought to myself, again, let me try something a bit different. So I took a fixed term appointment for a year at the Charity Commission. So I'd done a lot of charity work as a barrister in chambers. So it was something that I knew. So again, talking about taking risks, sometimes you can take managed risks by going into something, but it was an offshoot of what we've done before. And as I say, literally from my first day, I felt like I had really come home. So I absolutely loved my time at Charity Commission, but it was only a year's contract. So I had a decision to make whether to stay at the Charity Commission or whether to move to the wider government legal profession. And the thing for me is that I've always been fascinated by politics. I come from a political family. So those barristers that I've talked about were politicians, and certainly my grandfather was intending to be one of the politicians and ministers of government in the new India. He died literally weeks before Indian independence. And so it was my grandmother who took on his mantle, became the MP. I used to go and visit her in her MP's quarters in Delhi. She was a junior minister at one point as well. So I'd always had in this land, I guess, law and politics and policy. So just really interesting. And as soon as I had the opportunity to go and work for the government legal department, where those three were absolutely intersecting, I jumped at the chance. Mm-hmm. And so I moved to the department for education and had a brilliant time there as a junior lawyer.
Excellent. And I know in government legal, one of the things people often do is move around to lots of different departments. Yeah. So is that the same with you? Did you travel around many different areas?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is one of the great joys. Now, we're large enough that if people want to specialise, we can absolutely accommodate that. But one of the best bits I think about the government legal profession is that you perfect your art by seeing it in a range of different sectors. Mm-hmm. So I spent the majority of my career below the senior civil service in the Cabinet Office in number 10. And then the majority of my career in the senior civil service as a deputy director back at the Department for Education. But I also did a stint at Transport, which was amazing, a really good counterpoint to the work that I'd done, the social policy work that I'd done at Education. And then as a director, I spent the majority of my career at the Department for Health and Social Care, where I led on the COVID response, as you'll remember, Erica. So I've moved around a lot of different departments. And I think what that really enables you to do, as I say, is to develop your understanding, particularly of public law. That's mostly what we do, but we do also have employment lawyers and commercial lawyers, but really understanding that in a variety of different sectors. So it sharpens your skill set, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think it is? I mean, I've got my own view, but what do you think it is that makes it so interesting being a lawyer working for the government?
So the work is really novel. There's nothing like it in the rest of the profession. So we're often having to think creatively from first principles about things that have just not been done before. I mean, COVID is a really good example. My goodness, we had never locked down the country before. We had no experience of that at all. So there were powers that we had in the 1984 Act that had never been used to manage a pandemic or outbreak of disease. And we really had to test the boundaries of those powers. And as soon as we were making the law in that space, we were challenged in the courts. So as we were making policy, as we were implementing that policy, we were being challenged. So again, there's very few areas of any kind of legal practice where that would be happening to you. So I would say that it's the creativity of what we do, the fact that we're working from first principles, but also the scrutiny that we get from the courts, from the media and from Parliament that bring a really unique dimension to everything that we do in government law.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, I mean, it's probably worth saying, because I mean, I certainly didn't know about government legal until I became involved with government legal. And I used to think if people ever said to me, would you ever go and work in government? I thought I would be drafting legislation. I thought that was the only thing that could be going on. And I guess for anyone who doesn't know, there are 3,000 or more lawyers that have now been brought together in a single department, servicing all of the departments and other arm's length bodies. So it's an amazing organization to be part of. And as you say, the work is so interesting, all this challenge in the courts that people probably don't think about. But also for me, I think the fact that you are dealing with real life every day is a bit like, for me, like a doctor if you talk to a doctor, they're always interesting because they're dealing with something that you can identify with. If you talk to me as a derivatives and structured finance lawyer, you're not going to find anything very interesting in there to talk about. But I always remember talking to someone quite junior, I guess at DEFRA, and they were the litter expert. And they were so excited that they were the expert on litter. And they were like, if it's over the size of a bin bag, that's fly tipping, that's not me. But I can tell you everything there is to know about litter because it's part of our it's part of our daily life. So I think that's one of the reasons it's so fascinating. I mean, it'd be interesting. I mean, what do you think about dealing with politicians? I mean, it's hard for the general public to, I guess, sympathize with the pressure that they're under. It's very easy to criticize them, but they are under huge scrutiny and pressure, and they're often not very experienced in the area they're suddenly, plopped into. But what's your approach to dealing with ministers and politicians?
So, you know what? I have a huge amount of respect for politicians. I think it is such a tough job being a minister. And I think understanding that means that my approach to them is one of treating them as people, first of all, people doing a really difficult job, second of all, and people doing a job where often, you can't win because, you're making really, really hard decisions that an appreciable part of our population is just not going to agree with. And when I think about our female politicians in particular, the amount of challenges they get, the threats that they live under, you couldn't but admire people for putting that public service first. So I always think about what I would feel like if I was having to make that decision. I would want the very best legal advice. I would want precision. I would want to understand exactly what risk I was taking on and what would happen if that risk was to eventuate. And I think that's the thing that we often miss as lawyers. We talk about risk pretty comfortably, I think. What we're less good at is talking to ministers or other clients about what the impact of that risk going the wrong way for you might be. And that is often the thing that helps ministers make the difficult decisions that they have to make. But my experience is that most of them, firstly, are incredibly bright. They are really bright, really committed people who've gone into the world that they've gone into because they genuinely want to make a positive difference. So I absolutely treat them with respect, and I'm very pleased that they're doing their job rather than me doing my job.
I'll come back to that because I want to ask you about politics, given the family connection. I mean, I do think that point about risk is really interesting because I think, particularly early on in your career, you're trying to get the law right, to get, whatever, transaction right, drafting right. And if you're trying to identify what the risks are. But sometimes there might be a big risk, but actually its impact could be very little. And, as someone who's a transactional lawyer, we spend hours and hours on words in contracts. And sometimes if you really look at a contract, you're like, is someone really going to sue on this? Is it really going to be important? And sometimes the answer is yes, but often it's not. And I presume you've come across situations where it feels high risk, but actually the impact could be pretty low.
Completely that. And there are sometimes when even a small risk is intolerable for whatever reason. Particularly on the national security side, for example, we might be much less likely to take risks. We might do in a commercial setting. So you have to understand what the risk appetite is for a minister or other party you're dealing with. You absolutely have to understand what the broader landscape is, how likely it is that someone will challenge or not. And that obviously feeds into the consideration as well. I think there's also a tendency when you're a new lawyer to sort of try and uncover every single risk. And that's something that I think, I'd caution against because, again, to be credible with the person that you're advising, the risk has to be an appreciable risk, really, for them to take account of it, I'd say.
Yeah. So what's your advice for dropping, so you've identified all these risks. They all feel quite important. You can see some are worse than others. It's quite hard, isn't it? When you're learning to go, I'm not even going to tell them about this risk.
Yeah. So I think what you can do is talk about other risks, which are less important that you've excluded because you don't think that they are going to be determinative of the issue. So you can, put that sort of, you can mention that there are other risks that explain why you're not going to be focusing on them. And often we are in that space. So very often, particularly at my level, we're having to advise at real speed with very little knowledge. You might not really understand what the issues are, but still you've got to give advice that is actionable. And I think that's the thing to always remember. What advice are you giving that enables somebody to take a decision and act upon that advice? So if it's simply theoretical, or it's academic, or it's sitting on the fence, that's impossibly hard for people. So I think, if you can put yourself in the position of the decision maker, I think that often helps you to craft your advice in such a way that it can be acted upon.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. And I'm sure people listening would love to hear a bit about like what the COVID experience was like. I guess from the beginning of realizing this was something going into lockdown. I mean, and I guess you were having to go in all the time during lockdown. So can you just talk us through what it was like?
You know what? In fact, we didn't go in during lockdown. We were working from home, and thank heavens we were, because we did not have enough hours of the day to also commute as well as work. So it was really evident from about late January, early February that this was something that was really going to impact us in a way that we probably at stage couldn't even foresee. So we knew we were taking a step into the unknown, and we dusted off our powers. We knew that we had these powers that we would need to rely on were there a pandemic. We looked at work that had been done previously to identify how those powers could be exercised in the past, but they had never been exercised. So we were doing all the good things that lawyers should do, which is anticipate what's coming down the line, dust off work that had been done previously, start to think about how we might have to react. And the very first set of regs that we made, this is statutory instruments, the very first step we made over a weekend early in February, and that was to deal with the people who had come back from Wuhan and actually quarantining them to see whether or not they had the infection. So that was the first time that we'd done anything like locking down a group of people or quarantine. And the advice that we had to give to ministers, we had very little time to give it and very little time to make the regulations, because we knew that people were coming back and they would simply disperse into the community. So there was a bit of fear. I think it's fair to say there was a bit of fear about how we were going to do this and do this well. There was that sense in which, if we were litigated and found to have exceeded our powers, that would stop us dead in our tracks for anything that came down the line. And I remember when we made that first lot of regulations early on the Monday morning, we'd made them literally over the weekend. The minister would sign them first thing in the morning. The legal commentators started off by saying that we had exceeded our powers. Wow. And then within a couple of hours, they had all pretty much retreated from that. Okay. So although there was grumbling, we thought to ourselves, okay, we've done this well, we're on the right side of the line, and we weren't challenged on those regulations. They then became the foundation for everything that followed. And it was working night and day. I mean, sometimes we were working 18 hours a day, sometimes more. As I say, we didn't have time to commute. And we used to say to one another, thank heavens we were able to work from home, because literally we'd fall out of bed, do the job that needed to be done, fall into bed, and we'll start again the next day. It was a 7-day-a-week job. So I had lawyers who worked round the clock. And we tried to do all sorts of things like bring in shift working, bring in relief teams so that people could have time off. We, really encouraged people to have as much downtime as they could, but we did know, and I felt very guilty, Erica, that I was putting pressure on the lawyers to deliver, because there was no choice but to do that. There was no cavalry coming to help us out. We had to do it ourselves. We had to take as much recruitment as we could. We had to bring in people, borrow lawyers where we could. But fundamentally, it was going to be us doing the heavy lifting on that task. And it was really hard. And when I would see people, literally falling over sometimes, but certainly metaphorically falling over physically and emotionally, that sense of guilt was really immense as a leader.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting. I mean, it probably says something interesting about government legal, because I was talking to people, I had a sort of clinic where people could call me up, and if they were feeling stressed, like just someone to offload on, and I, if I had any tips, I give it to them. But often the people I was talking to were really worried about their boss, so they'd be really worried about you, and there's you worrying about them, but they'd also be worrying about you. But I guess you're never going to find a greater sort of committed purpose to all draw together on. So there was a real sense of purpose, I guess, behind it, that you were literally doing whatever you could to save the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And that shared enterprise was definitely one of the things that bound us together. But to be honest with you, even that can only take you so far. When you are working for 6 months, a year or 2 years at that pitch. So I only did the first year of that. And that probably was the hardest year, but some of my colleagues did it for 2 years.
Yeah.
And in fact, we've learned quite a lot of lessons from that. So we now have a rapid response team that we can deploy to help support teams that are going through that sort of pressure. We did an awful lot as an organisation. So I was the champion for the Parents Network. It's a new network at that stage. So I have 4 children and, trying to balance, homeschooling and all the rest of it alongside that work was really hard. But we got to know one another better. We got to know one another's pressure points and challenges that bit better. And I think as an organisation, we've kept them. And I also think there is something as a leader, it can be very tempting when you are facing that, huge challenge to lead from the front and be the hero leader. And actually, it was more important. I wish I'd kind of focused on this earlier. It was more important for me to show people that I was finding it hard and that I was struggling as much as they were struggling. And that was part of what kept people going in a sense, because they knew that you were finding it hard too, and they didn't feel quite so bad that they were finding.
No, that's interesting. When did you come to that realization?
It was probably the summer. So I would say the June or July. So we'd already been going about 5 or 6 months by that point, and we'd had a really difficult time during May. That was when we were having to make a lot of really difficult decisions about some of the things that we were doing. So we worked like crazy during that period. And, I felt it was my job to be really positive and optimistic and keep people going. And yes, there is definitely a role for a leader in doing that, giving people the hope and understanding, celebrating the success and the understanding of what they've achieved. But it was really apparent by June when I was kind of on my knees that I needed to show people that I was on my knees. And I had a very wise non-executive director at the department who said to me, take leave and be really ostentatious about the fact that you are going on leave. But I felt, that was a little bit awful. That'd be like rubbing people's noses in it. But she was absolutely right. Because if I wasn't showing that I was looking after myself and taking time out, they didn't do that.
Yeah.
And I also remember, Erica, you came and spoke to us in the summer. We had an away day where we made time to talk about and think about how we were feeling. We don't often do that emotional law piece, but I think it's really important we do. And you came and did a barnstorming keynote for us and really talked to people about the need to look after themselves. And all of that really helped.
Yeah, amazing. So that clearly was a pretty pivotal experience, I assume, in your career. Are there other moments where you found things like very challenging or that have been really pivotal and you've learned something from them?
Yeah, my gosh, I have had so many things in my career that have been difficult. So the really big things that I did in my career was a corporate role of going over to DFT as the second in command to bring them into GLD. So you mentioned earlier that we brought all the lawyers together so that we were one big department of lawyers rather than having lawyers within departments serving that department. Now, that was a really huge cultural as well as a structural change for us. And I think I learned there about, again, emotion. That emotion has a really important part to play in all of this. And I think as rational lawyers, we think if we just explain the rationality and we show the facts and the figures and we evidence all the good stuff, that will be enough. I have absolutely learned that that's never enough. So really understanding what makes people tick, what motivates people, what their skills are, what their hopes are, what they might lose as well as what they might gain is just a really important dimension of leading people and particularly leading cultural change.
Yeah, you're so right. Like we focus on the black letter of the law and not the emotion and the story behind it. So that is a great piece of advice. Yeah. Okay. And cultural change is probably, any behavior for coaching behavioral change is the hardest thing. And the cultural change is incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard to shift a culture. Yeah. Good. And then can I ask you, like, in the future, would you ever consider going into politics?
Oh, it's such a great question. I do love politics. I absolutely love politics. But I probably love politics as an outsider to politics in some respects, or at least having a connection to it, but not one that's right at the centre. I do have politics in my family. I absolutely admire politicians. I would love to be a constituency MP. I think there is something so fulfilling about representing people in that way. I can absolutely see it. So I think probably our future in politics doesn't lie for me down the path, but I would always admire anybody who goes into it, because my goodness, it's not easy.
And never say never. You never know.
You never know.
And can I ask you, so I always end with like 3 pieces of advice to your younger self. Like what are your 3 pieces of advice to your younger self, do you think?
So, you know what? My first bit of advice is trust your judgment. I think particularly when you're starting out, everyone has a view. Everyone will tell you what to think, but you know yourself really well. You know what your values are. You know what your interests are. You know what you get out of bed for. And I think you should trust your judgment in that. And allied to that is that if it's not working for you, change it. So I'm really pleased that, I changed things when they weren't working for me. So have the confidence to change things. And sometimes that does mean taking risks, and it can be managed risk, but it does sometimes involve taking risks. So trust your judgment, take a few risks. And maybe the last thing I'd say is that nothing is wasted. Or maybe if I were to put it in a more positive way, everything matters, because each one of us comes with our collection of experience. And that is what most organizations need. They need us to bring all of ourselves into the organization. So if you've taken the meandering path that I have taken, or if you come from a background that's a little less represented in the law, value that, because what you bring is what organizations want.
Yeah.
And nothing is wasted.
Amazing. Well, Mel, thank you so much for taking this time to talk to us. It's been amazing. And for anyone listening, go and find out about Government Legal. It's an amazing organisation. I wish I'd worked there properly, not just on the board. If I could dial back my career, I would absolutely apply. So go and have a look at it and think about it. And Mel, thank you so much.
That's a pleasure. Thanks, Erica.